everyone, welcome. Hello, welcome to the 6th Knit-Along Zoom and Knit. I hope everybody's still having fun and knitting away, maybe casting on a second sweater by this point. If you have it with you, hold up your sweater. Let's see how everybody's coming along. Oh, this is the body of my sweater right there. Oh, I see a striped sweater. Hiromi and Margaret and Allie are joining me as moderators, and we all have our works in progress. Allie and I are doing the same color. We're sweater twins. Okay. And also, while we're waiting, just for fun, if you want, go ahead and type where you're joining us from in the chat. Always fun to see who's nearby, who's far away. See if you can make any knitting friends in the chat. Awesome. Seattle, St. Paul, Albuquerque, Rhode Island. All right. Great. Always so fun. Is there anybody from outside of the US? I don't know if this is the best time of day for people from other continents, unfortunately. I think I've heard that early or later in the evening is better for some of our European friends who are knitting along with us. Elizabethtown, Kentucky, welcome. All right. Hi, everyone. I think I said 6th Zoom and Knit when you were logging on. This is actually our 5th Zoom and Knit. I got a little bit ahead of myself, but thank you for coming. This is, we're knitting our Lightweight Raglan Pullover Knit-Along. If you haven't been here before, my name is Juliana. I'm the social media and outreach coordinator at Purl Soho. I'm also joined today by Margaret from our customer service team, Allie, our e-commerce coordinator, and Hiromi, our senior design assistant. Definitely seeing a lot of familiar faces. We were noticing as you guys were logging on. It's wonderful to have you back if you've been with us before. If you are new to our knit-along, however, welcome. I know people are still joining in, even though we're about 5 months in. That doesn't mean you can't join the knit-along. You probably already know, but if this is your first time here, this is Purl Soho's first, but definitely not last official knit-along. And we're working on this really wonderful free pattern, the Lightweight Raglan Pullover. It's actually a fantastic pattern for first-time sweater knitters. Raise your hand if this is your first sweater. Oh, I see one, at least one of you. I know there are more than one of you who are knitting your first sweater with us, and that is so wonderful. We still have just under 3 months left in the knit-along, so I know a lot of knitters are nearing the end of their sweater or have already finished. Some of you are even casting on a second sweater, which is incredible. I'm just finishing, I think tonight I'm going to join the body and the sleeves together. But no matter where you are, we're so happy to have you here. If you are just getting started, or if you're getting started again, just a reminder that our previous Zoom and Knit sessions are available on YouTube. Hiromi is going to put the links to those recordings in the chat right now. So in those recordings, we're basically going through the sweater step by step. There are a lot of tips for doing the cording stitch, which can be tricky. Tips for increasing on the sleeves, how to knit sleeves 2 at a time. So if you need a refresher, you can always check back on YouTube and give those a watch. They're also in the description of each of those YouTube videos. There are timestamps to the different, oops, I just clicked the video link. I don't need to watch those right now. There are timestamps to the different points, the different techniques that we cover. So you don't have to watch the whole thing if you don't want to. Also, today we're going to be covering some of the further along parts of the sweater as we are getting close to the end. Since many of you have finished knitting, we're going to be talking about some finishing techniques. I know this isn't always everyone's favorite part of knitting, because when you're done knitting, you just want to be done, right? Like, but it's really important to take the time to be mindful about these last steps, because this is really what will give your sweater a polished, finished look, where people maybe in public may not even believe that you knit your sweater if you do a really good job on the finishing step. I will always kind of a mixed mind myself when somebody doesn't think I've knit my sweater. I want them to know how much work I put into it, but it's also kind of a compliment if people think you bought your sweater. So we're going to talk about, this sweater is knit seamlessly from the bottom up, so there's no actual seaming, but we're going to talk about the Kitchener stitch, which is how you finish the underarms of the sweater. And we'll have some tricks for how to close up holes at the corners of the underarms, even after you've done the Kitchener stitch. They are kind of inevitable, so it's good to know how to take care of those. We'll also talk about two of my favorite methods for weaving in ends, as well as blocking your sweater. If you're not that far along, don't worry, this video will be up on YouTube with the rest, so that you can review those when you get to that point in your sweater. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them in chat. Even if your questions are not directly related to what we're talking about, we'll get to any questions we can as we're going, but we're also going to have a Q&A session at the end. If you're, at a different step of the sweater, if you want us to review something else, please go ahead and ask. We'd be happy to help you out with that. And then once we get everybody's questions answered, we would love to see your progress. We will have an opportunity for some show and tell towards the end of the meeting. Just as a reminder, we are recording this Zoom in Knit to make it available later for people who couldn't join us live. If you don't wish to be recorded, you can turn off your camera and microphone and still follow along with us. So let's get started. I'm going to switch over to my document camera. And all right, so first things first, we are going to be talking about Kitchener stitch. So when you're finished with the sweater, I have like sort of a little pseudo sweater here just for demonstration. After you join your body and your sleeves together and you do your raglan decreases, you will have some live stitches that you placed on hold, both from the underarm and from the body of the sweater. And we're going to be joining those with Kitchener. You can see I've still done it on this. I've already done it on this little sample here. Hiromi just put a link to our Kitchener stitch video in tutorial in the chat. Our tutorial has both a video component and a written out component if you prefer to learn in that method. So that's another good resource. I am still going to go over Kitchener stitch and share some tips for fixing your tension and a few other things. Just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to be using a different color of yarn. Obviously, when you're doing this on your actual sweater, you will use the same yarn so that it's really invisible. Ideally, you can even use the yarn that's attached, that's left over here, so that you don't have extra ends to weave in. But for demonstration, I'm going to be using this pink yarn so you can really see the stitches. So when you're done with knitting the sweater, you're going to have these two sets of live stitches, which you're going to put on an extra needle. At this point, your needles should be empty, so you can just grab two needles the same size. I will confess, in other projects, when I haven't had my needles available, I've used a smaller size needle just to hold the stitches while I'm doing the Kitchener stitch. It works just fine. But ideally, you should be using the same needles you used for the rest of your project, as well as the same yarn. So, sorry, I'm just going to try to make this a little clearer for you. There we go. You're going to start, there's one step that's a little different from the rest, which is you're going to put your yarn, we're going to refer to this as the front needle and the back needle. I like to keep one finger in between while I'm working on them, just to keep it a little more organized. So you're going to start on the front needle by putting your tapestry needle that's threaded with your yarn through the first stitch on the front needle, purlwise, and pull it through. Since I'm using a different yarn, I'm going to leave just like a 5 or 6 inch tail. If you were using the yarn that was attached, you could pull it kind of snug. Then I'm going to go over to the back needle, put my needle in, put my tapestry needle in as if I'm knitting into that first stitch on the needle and pull it through. So at this point, I have not yet removed any stitches, but I've put my yarn through both the front needle and the back needle. Now we're going to go back to the front needle, and this is where the actual repeatable part of the Kitchener stitch begins. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my tapestry needle into the first stitch as if to knit and slide that stitch off of the knitting needle. Then I'm going to put my tapestry needle into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and pull my yarn through. Then I'm going to, so it's 2 stitches on the front, 2 stitches on the back. Now I'm going to go to the back needle, put my tapestry needle into the first stitch as if to purl and slide it off the needle. Put my tapestry needle into the second stitch as if to knit, but leave it on the needle and pull my yarn through. I will sometimes just for, I have this pretty well memorized, but if you don't have it memorized, I find it pretty helpful to just write down on a piece of paper, front needle, off to knit, on to purl, back needle, off to purl, on to knit. You can even buy, I have seen keychains with like a really quick description of the Kitchener stitch, because once you get going, it does become repeatable. It does come pretty easy to remember. However, if you haven't done it in a while, because it's usually something you only do at the end of a project, or maybe every once in a while, you're probably going to forget in between projects. So again, on the front needle, you take your first stitch off as if to knit. So I'm going to go into that stitch as if I'm knitting with the tapestry needle, slide it off. The second stitch is on as if to purl. So I'm going to put my tapestry needle in as if I'm purling, but leave the stitch on and pull my yarn through. Now on the back needle, I'm going to take the first stitch off as if to purl. So I'm going to put my tapestry needle in as if I'm purling, slide that stitch off. The second stitch is on as if to knit. So I'm going to put my tapestry needle in as if I'm knitting, leave the stitch on the needle and pull the yarn through. So a little more sped up on the front needle, off as if to knit, on as if to purl, and pull your yarn through. On the back needle, off as if to purl, on as if to knit. Then returning to the front needle, off as if to knit, on as if to purl. My yarn got caught for a second there. On the back needle, off as if to purl, on as if to knit. Now I am leaving my tension very loose here, as you can see. You can see this pink yarn is super, super loose. That is mostly for demonstration purposes. When I'm doing this for an actual project, I try to match the tension of my existing stitches, because that is ultimately the goal, to make it look invisible, by just sort of tugging each one. But of course, it's not perfect. It never, ever comes out perfect. It would be so nice if it did. So I'm going to do a couple more and then show you how to tighten that up or loosen it as needed after the fact. So let me do a few more, pulling it tighter. So off as if to knit, on as if to purl, off as if to purl, on as if to knit, off as if to knit, on as if to purl, off as if to purl, on as if to knit. So let's say you get to the end of your Kitchener stitch, or halfway through. If it's a long one, you can pause and do this, and you take a look and your tension's all over the place. That's pretty normal. That doesn't necessarily mean you've done anything wrong. I think that happens to a lot of us. But what you can do, and it is a little easier right now because I'm using this contrast yarn. If it was the same yarn, you just have to pay a little more attention to make sure you're getting the same strand, is you can go through and tighten this half stitch by half stitch until you have that tension all evened out. So I'm going to start at the end where I started and give this a little tug. Sometimes I'll use my fingers to make sure I'm pulling on the right end, the correct half of the stitch, because my goal right now is to tighten this stitch over here to the right. Then I'm going to move to the next stitch, to the next strand of yarn to the left and give that a tug, tightening up its partner right here. And I'm just going to work my way along. So I've just pulled on this one. Now I'm going to move to the next strand to the left, which is right here, and give that a tug, tightening up its partner on the right. And this is not really an exact science. You're just going to look at that stitch you just tightened up and make sure it's about the same size as the ones next to it. Then I'm going to move to the next half a stitch to the left and do the same thing. Give it a tug, tightening up its partner to the right. And you just work your way down that column of stitches, using your fingers whenever you need to. You know, I check frequently to make sure the stitch I just tightened up is more or less the same size as the ones on either side of it. And then keep moving down to the left until you get out to the end, where you will eventually get to your sort of working yarn for the Kitchener stitch. Or if you had finished doing your entire Kitchener stitch by the time you were correcting your tension, you would get to the end of your piece of fabric, your knitted fabric, and just be able to tug on the yarn itself. All right, I'm just about there. So I'm going to tighten up that last one. And there we go. So now I've taken it from that sort of loose, loopy Kitchener stitch to something that actually would look invisible if it was the same color as the knitting. Now, fortunately for this pattern and for many sweaters where you're going to be using this, the Kitchener stitch is in your underarm. So it's not somewhere terribly obvious, right? Like if your Kitchener stitch is not totally perfect in this pattern, nobody's really going to know because it's fairly well hidden. However, I still like to, make sure it's as nice as I can make it before I move on. And you can do the same thing if you've accidentally pulled too tight. Let me see if I can manage to pull a couple too tight and do the reverse. But you essentially do the same thing, except when I'm tightening, you move from right to left. So you're moving from where you started to one of the edges. And if you're loosening, you're going to have to start by adding some extra tension at the left, or adding some extra looseness at the left, and working that extra bit of yarn, that looseness, over to the tight spots. Let me see if I can do this too tight and see how that looks. So I'm going to really yank on it, which I would not recommend when you're doing Kitchener stitch. You don't want to really yank on it. When I'm doing Kitchener stitch in an actual project, I try to keep it a little snug, but not overly snug. Just sort of find that Goldilocks tension. Right now I am pulling it quite tight, so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so here are some stitches that are much too tight. Again, if this was the same color, too tight would be better than too loose. You probably wouldn't be able to see too clearly that your stitches were too tight if this was the same color. And in the underarm, this wouldn't be terrible, but it's not quite right. So to loosen up those stitches, if you've done your Kitchener stitch too tight, I just sort of did it without thinking about it. But I start at the edge where my live yarn is and sort of pull apart. And that just sort of naturally loosens up this edge stitch here. Then you can start by the edge stitch, pull it a little bigger than you'd want it, move over to its partner stitch and pull some of that tension over to the right. And again, use your fingers if you have to get it going the right direction. And then I can move to the next strand of yarn to the right, give it a little tug, taking up a little more of that yarn. And it kind of helps to just sort of, I like tug my stitches this way. And that really actually does a lot to move any excess tension over to somewhere that it's too tight. So that's how you're going to correct your Kitchener stitch if you need to. Now, when you get to the end of your Kitchener stitch, you just sort of stop wherever you are. Let me see if I can get over there quickly. So we're going to back needle, off as if to purl, on as if to knit, front needle, off as if to knit, on as if to purl. Because I often have people say, well, what happens when you only have 2 stitches left? You just sort of stop wherever you are. Oh, I might not have given myself a long enough piece of yarn. I didn't actually measure. If you are doing Kitchener stitch and you have to measure how much yarn, generally about 3 times the length of your seam is going to be enough to do Kitchener stitch. You can see I didn't measure. I just grabbed a piece of yarn. I don't think I'm going to make it, but that's all right. I think I can still. It's going to be close, but I might be able to show you what to do with those last 2 stitches. No, I'm not going to make it. I still have 5 stitches left, but you basically just sort of stop wherever you are. You can see, you know, when I'm not paying attention, my tension is still not perfect. So if this was the real thing, I would go ahead and tighten that up to match the rest of my stitches. But you're essentially going to end with a half. So right now, let's imagine these were the last 2 stitches. I have just on the back needle, I ended by going through this second stitch as if to knit and leaving it on. On the front needle, I had gone through the second stitch as if to purl and leaving it on. You could just stop right there. You do have the option of ending by going through the back stitch as if to knit and taking it off, and the front stitch as if to purl and taking it off. So essentially doing the second halves of the Kitchener stitch. If you think of it as 2, you know, the front on the front needle, you take it off as if to knit, on as if to purl. So we're just leaving off the on as if to purl part. On the back needle, similarly, you take the first stitch off as if to purl, leave the second stitch on as if to knit. We're leaving off that second half of the step. I don't always do that because you're generally going to have to weave your ends in anyway at this point. And if you've done that second half of the stitch, when you're correcting your tension, it can be really tricky to pull through that second half of the stitch. So I usually will just end wherever I was, correct my tension, and then when I weave this end in, if there's any looseness there, I'll use it to correct that. All right, so that is the Kitchener stitch for the armpits. Anybody have any questions before we move on? Okay, so after the Kitchener stitch, we are going to be left with holes in the armpits, as you can see in this little partial sweater sample. I just like our sweater that we're working on, I knitted a sleeve, I knitted a body, I put them together, leaving some live stitches from both the sleeve and the body, and then did some raglan decreases just so this is sort of recognizably a sweater. And after I did my Kitchener stitch using the yarn that was attached, I believe it was this yarn that was still attached from the sleeve. I used that little bit of yarn that was left. Sometimes you will see in patterns instructions to leave a long tail of yarn when you are joining your sleeves, or in this case, since it was a bottom-up sweater, I have seen patterns where at the end of the sleeve, when it says to put your stitches on hold, it will say leave a long tail of yarn. I don't believe our pattern specifically says that. Not all patterns say that, but it is kind of a good practice just to sort of get yourself in the habit of, because it's nice to have enough yarn both to do the Kitchener stitch and to correct the holes that are left on either side. Of course, if you forget, you can always join another piece of yarn. It's a pretty forgiving step. But also often when you're reading a pattern, it'll say close up any holes using extra yarn, but then not tell you how to do that. So I'm going to give you some tips how I like to close up these holes. So I do have enough yarn here. For this little sample, this is probably enough yarn to close up the first hole. I'll probably have to cut another piece of yarn for the second hole, but we'll see. So step one is go to the inside of the sweater. So I'm going to turn it inside out, and I'm going to find my tail and poke it through that hole and get it on my tapestry needle. So when you look at this hole, one thing you kind of don't want to do is just stitch straight across like this. This is kind of tempting, but what happens often when you do that is it closes up the big hole, but it leaves you with another hole right next to it. This is something I see pretty commonly. Yes, you could keep stitching back and forth and eventually all your stitches, all your holes would be closed up. But it kind of creates more holes while you're correcting the big one that you then have to close up. So what I prefer to do instead is go around in sort of a circle around the hole. And when I can, hopefully you can see sort of the structure of the stitches. So if you look right here, we have, see if I can tug this so you can see. When I'm looking at the wrong side of stockinette stitch, I think of these as rainbows and smiles. And if you look right at the edge of this hole here, you can see there's a smile here and a smile here, and then a rainbow, sort of similar to the regular structure of stockinette. It's a little stretched out and it's a little distorted because we're at the armhole hole. So what I'm going to do as much as possible is I'm going to mimic that structure of the stitch. So in this case, I'm going to follow this strand of yarn by coming up through this smile, tracing along the path of that rainbow and coming back down through the smile next to it. And then I'm going to rotate around to the next side of the hole. Over here, it's a little different. The edge of the hole is actually, now that I've rotated it, is a smile. So I've now come up here. I'm now going to go down through this rainbow and then up through the next one, following the path of that yarn right there. And then I'm going to rotate around to the next side. And now on this sort of third side, you can see again, it's stretched out, it's distorted. But if you follow this path of yarn, it's coming up through this smile, going around this rainbow, and down through this next smile. So once I get around there, I should be just about back where I started, if I can get through there without splitting the fiber. And once I've gone all the way around, I give it a little tug. And I always check from the right side. It's okay if it looks a little bunchy on the wrong side, but I do always check on the right side just to see how it looks. And this time it worked pretty well. It closed up pretty nicely. And again, keep in mind that this is the underarm of the sweater. In this little sample, it's pretty out here. If you were actually wearing this little sweater with a body in here, it would be more like this. It gets a little more hidden than it is here. But for me, I'm pretty happy with this. It mostly follows the path of the stitches. I am going to take my yarn back out to the right side now and see if I can correct. There's a little bump here that I don't love. So I'm going to bring my yarn up through the center of that hole, giving it another little tug to make sure it's still staying tight. And I'm going to now, almost like I'm doing duplicate stitch, if you're familiar with duplicate stitch, I'm going to sort of poke that little bit in that was sticking out and duplicate stitch around here, following the path of the yarn and going back through to the wrong side. And now I'm very happy with this. Now this looks mostly invisible, especially with blocking. Armpits are a high friction, high heat, high moisture, unfortunately, area. So a lot of yarns tend to felt a little bit. I know all my sweaters tend to get some degree of felting in the underarms, which both closes up this hole more and kind of serves to disguise anything a little weird that might be happening. So for me, this is pretty good. There's one bump here that I also don't love. So let me see if I can correct. Oops, I lost my yarn from my tapestry needle. Let me see if I can correct that one bump that looks a little bit, it just looks like it's going a little contrary to the direction of the stitches. And it's partially that it's going this way. It's part of the direction of the stitches this way, but it's running into the opposite stitches from the raglan. But I'm just going to see if I can sort of cover that up a little bit. again, with a bit of duplicate stitch, just going, actually, I'm gonna come up over here. So I'm coming up at the top of that strand of yarn that's kind of bothering me and just going right over it back down into the next one and giving it a little tug to sort of disguise it. This is not a, I guess, a science. So for instance, if we were doing mattress stitch has a very set rules that you follow, and it's very particular. Closing up your underarm holes, not so much. There are other methods that will work fine. And even when I'm doing it, you know, I always follow this method and then look at it and sometimes go, oh, it didn't work that time, and have to go back. It's a little bit more of an art. So sometimes you do have to play around with it or start over to get it to look exactly the way you want. I just find in general, if I follow that circular motion, instead of trying to go straight across the gap, I get much better results. And also keep in mind, even if it doesn't look completely flawless, when this is blocked, it's going to look a lot better. When it's worn, it's going to be sort of disguised. So let me see. So then you have the option when you go to do the second one. If you have left a long tail of yarn, what I will usually do is just sort of weave my yarn over to the other hole so that I don't have to weave in another end. This time, this is not really a long enough tail of yarn. Once I get over there and go around, it's not going to be long enough to weave in. So I'm going to just grab my yarn and cut another piece. And close up that hole. So starting over now with nothing attached, I'm still going to do the same thing, just so you can still get the idea. So I'm looking for the yarn that's already there, and as much as I can, following the existing path of the yarn. So right now I can see there's a piece of yarn that goes under here and comes up here. And then there's another piece of yarn that comes out here and goes under here. And then sort of for the third side, I can see if I pull it apart, and sometimes you have to pull it apart a little bit, that same piece of yarn I was just following actually comes over here and goes through this bump, this purl bump. So I'm going to follow that same one. And then now, obviously, if I just pull, it's going to come right through because nothing's attached. So I'm going to hold this while I give it a little tug and then go to the right side and see how it looks. In this case, since I can't really pull on it without pulling it through, I'm going to quickly weave in my short end just so I have something to tug against while I'm tightening this up. And I'm going next on the agenda, we're going to talk more about weaving in ends, but this is just a real quick over, under. And I'm not even going to go two directions. We'll talk more about weaving in ends in a second. I just want to get around to closing up this underarm hole. So now if I give this a tug again and go back to the right side, it's pretty good. Again, as always, there's some stitches that are just a little looser than I would like. So I'm going to try to duplicate the stitch those shut a little bit by coming up at the bottom of one stitch that's a little loose. And this is, I'm trying to get it to focus a little better. This is sort of the stitch that's bothering me right here. So I'm going to, almost as if I was doing a duplicate stitch, follow this around here and under here and see if that works. Oh, come on. There. And then go back down in the same hole where I started. And we do also have, we'll be linking our weaving in ends tutorial shortly. And it goes into weaving in ends via duplicate stitch in detail. This is obviously a little more complicated place to do duplicate stitch because we've got multiple directions of knitting. However, if you were to practice weaving in by duplicate stitch, just to get an idea of the structure of a stitch, where the yarn usually goes, That's a good starting point for getting used to recognizing these stitches. So when you see a loose stitch that you don't like, you can have a good idea of where to start if you're going to mimic the direction of that stitch to tighten it up. Now here we've got a looser stitch, and this is like basically the last stitch of the body before the held stitches. That's just looser than the rest of the stitches. So I'm actually going to kind of try to tack it down to the underside. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. By going through that loop and then pulling my yarn back down to the wrong side. And I think that worked pretty well this time. And I've still got a little bit of a gap, but again, I'm just going to come up at the bottom of that gap, mimic the shape of the stitch, and then go back down to the wrong side where I started. All right, that's now looking pretty good. I often find, like, sometimes I do it and there are no lumps and I'm very happy with myself. Other times I do it and there's a little bit of a lump. This time, this side has a little bit more of a lump than the first side. But again, with blocking, with wearing, I know from experience that's going to be fine. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. So this is now, if you compare how it was before when we had a big open hole, we're now closed up, we're looking pretty good, ready for blocking. And when this is worn with a real body inside, that little questionable area sort of pulls straight into the underarm and won't be visible. So that's how to close up your underarm seams. Now, next, we're going to talk about weaving in the ends. So I did that quick weaving in right there. The first thing we're going to talk about is, this is the right swatch? This is the right swatch. My hole disappeared with blocking. It's kind of amazing. How to get started. Hiromi just put the link to our Weaving in Your Ends tutorial. Our Weaving in Your Ends tutorial shows, I believe, 4 or 5 different methods for doing that. I'm going to focus on 2 today. These are my 2 favorite. They're also the 2 easiest. And for this sweater especially, they work great because linen quill has this sort of, it has this rustic texture that actually makes it quite forgiving in hiding your ends when you're weaving them in. You're not going to see nearly as much. If this was a super smooth yarn, this is Morning that I'm using for my sample swatches. Morning's a little trickier. Also, the other advantage linen quill has over Morning is the fact that it has wool and alpaca content. So those ends will sort of naturally felt into place with washing, with wearing. Morning, other cotton yarns, you have to be more thorough in weaving in your ends because cotton obviously doesn't felt. So you want to make sure your ends are super, super secure. You still want to make sure your ends are secure in linen quill, of course, but if they're not totally perfect with time, they are going to only become more secure. So first thing we're going to talk about is once you've joined your yarn, some methods leave a hole. Another thing we talked about last time, how to actually join your new strand of yarn, we do have a tutorial for how to join a new strand of yarn on our website. And what we have you do is just stop knitting with the old yarn and start knitting with the new yarn. And this does leave a hole. I believe I mentioned that last time, that if there's a hole, it's fine. This is how it looks from the right side. It's a small hole, but there is a hole. The other method I like, which I prefer and use myself, is knitting one stitch with both the old and the new yarn held together. The advantage is, where is it? It's right here. It does not leave a hole. It does make a slightly bulkier stitch. So this would not work if you were using something like a super bulky yarn like Gentle Giant. I probably would not recommend this method because that slightly bulky stitch is going to look really bulky with a bulkier yarn. In linen quill, it works great. I don't even know if I can find a spot where I've joined it. Oh, here's where I've joined in yarn. Right, you can't even see it, but right here I have joined yarn by doing one stitch with both strands held together. Because linen quill is so thin, because it's so textured, you can't see it. If you're using cattail silk also, because it's so thin, because it's textured, you're going to get a similar result where you can't even see it. However, you know, joining your yarn by just stopping with your old strand, starting with your new strand is very acceptable, works with all weights of yarn, and it gives you the most control over what that stitch looks like. However, you do have to get rid of the hole. So to do so, when you start to weave in ends, all you're going to do is give them a little cross over like that. And then whichever one you start with, or whichever end you decide to weave in first, you're just going to, again, we're going back to the smiles and the rainbows. You can see that these two strands of yarn from joining the new yarn are both coming out of rainbows. So after crossing it over, I'm going to take this strand of yarn that was on the left. It's now on the right after crossing them. And I'm going to take it through that rainbow on the right, exactly where my yarn is coming from, in the opposite direction that the yarn is coming out of it, and just give it a little tug. Not too much of a tug, just a gentle little tug. Now I'm going to take the strand of yarn that was previously on the right, is now on the left, and I'm going to go into the corresponding rainbow on the left, going in the opposite direction, and give it a little tug. And so this now there's much less bulk than the method by doing two strands together for one stitch. And if we flip it over, I'm going to keep my finger there so I can make sure I'm showing you the right spot. It's completely indistinguishable from the rest of the stitches. So I know a lot of people don't like to weave in ends at all, so they will try other methods. This, however, is like, it's reliable, especially if you're using something with like a cotton yarn. I would not really suggest using a magic knot or a Russian join or anything like that. This is, you do have to weave in your ends, but it gives you a lot of control over what the stitch looks like from the right side of the work. And it's very secure once we weave in the ends. Now, when we've done the one stitch with the two strands held together, all I'm going to do to try to minimize that bulk on the right side is give both strands of yarn sort of individually a tug. And you can even see where I did it sort of similar to the Kitchener stitch. When I was getting ready to do it, you don't have quite as much control over that first couple stitches, so it got a little loose for a few stitches. So you can, if you wish, use your tapestry needle, just like I demonstrated with the Kitchener stitch, and tug that excess tension over and then give it a pull here. Or you can leave it, because in the grand scheme of things, probably nobody's going to see a couple loose stitches in your knitting, but up to you. And then that's it. You're already ready to weave in your ends. The only thing I would suggest, and I'm going to demonstrate the actual weaving using a different color of yarn, just to make it easier to see. I try to go in two different directions just to minimize bulk. So for instance, with this, this spot where I joined a yarn, I would probably do one strand going up and the other strand going down, just so I don't have all of that extra bulk from weaving in the ends concentrated in one area. You're sort of spreading it out into two different areas. And similar with this one, I would do one going down and one going up, even though on this swatch, I don't have quite as much room. So you might have to do a little bit more weaving to get it secure. But that's just going to make sure you don't have like a really thick, large spot in your finished garment. Although with all these things, blocking solves a multitude of problems. So we're going to pretend that this pink yarn is the ends we're weaving in, just for demonstration purposes. So there are two methods we're going to talk about today. In our tutorial, they're called the vertical method and the diagonal method. These are both very easy. They're very fast. They work with a large variety of yarns. The disadvantage to these two methods is they are more one-sided. You can see them relatively clearly from the wrong side of your work. From the right side of the work, they're totally invisible. So it is a great option for a sweater like this that's not reversible. And you know, if you were doing something like a blanket, there are some other methods in our weaving in your ends tutorial, specifically the duplicate stitch method, which I mentioned earlier. That looks the same on both the right and wrong side. It's pretty invisible on both the right and wrong side. However, it is a lot more complicated. There's a little bit of a steeper learning curve to do the duplicate stitch method. And it just takes longer. So I generally, when I can get away with it, will do the vertical or diagonal method, just to save time when I'm done with my sweater, because I also get kind of frustrated when I have to spend time weaving in ends after I finish knitting something. So we're going to start with the vertical method, and going back to the rainbows and the smiles, I'm going to bring my yarn up just somewhere right around here, or I won't even bring it up. What you're going to do for the vertical method is wherever your yarn is attached, you're going to look for a column of either rainbows or smiles. It does not matter which one you start with. And staying in that same column, you're going to go under one. Right now I'm doing rainbows, under a rainbow, over a rainbow, under a rainbow, over a rainbow, under, over, under, over, under, over, for about 1.5 to 2 inches. Again, as I was saying, linen quill's a little more forgiving, so I would probably stick on the 1.5 inch side of things. If you're using a cotton yarn, something a little bit slippery, probably 2 inches, maybe even 3, depending on how much you trust your yarn to grip onto itself. I'll do just one more. So you just go over, under, and you can see I've stayed all in the same column of purl bumps. Then you always want to go 2 directions, because should something some point in the future snag this woven in yarn, you want to make sure that you've got a second direction of woven in tails, so that this doesn't, because right now if this got snagged here, it can just pull straight out and you could end up with a hole in your knitting. So to make sure you're nice and secure in case it does get snagged, we're now going to go in the opposite direction. So this time I was just weaving up. I always start with up because it's easier for me to work away from myself. Now I'm going to weave down, and I'm just going to move right over to the next column. So since these were rainbows, I'm moving over to the next column of smiles, and I'm going to do the same thing. Over, under, over, under, over, under. And you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning. I usually go about 1/2 to 3/4 of the distance, again, depending on how well you trust your yarn, and then pull it through. So as you can see, you can see it from the right side. You can even see down here, I wove in my cast on tail down here, or from the wrong side, I'm sorry. You can see this from the wrong side. However, even in this contrasting yarn, when we flip it over to the right side, you can barely see just a little bit of that pink showing through. Down here is where I wove in the white tail from the cast on, and it's completely invisible. So this is fast, this is easy. It works great. It's very secure, especially once you've gone the 2 separate directions. And once you've done that, you can just cut off your tail. I do not cut my tail super close, especially before blocking. Sometimes I'll even leave like a 1/2 inch, maybe even 1 inch. And then after I've blocked my piece, I'll go back through and do a trim. But if I was to cut this, and I will cut it right on the edge, which it seems like you should do, the first time you stretch your knitting, it pops through. It pops up to the next one. So I generally cut with more of like a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch. I've also read this tip. I think this tip, I think the first place I read it was in a Coco Knits book. After you trim your tail to fluff it out, it's supposed to sort of encourage that felting process to start, because the tail of your yarn is fluffed out. Obviously, linen quill is a lot thinner. There's a lot less to fluff out than there is with morning, but it is supposed to help the yarn be less likely to pop through that last bar that you wove it through and start the felting process of becoming more secure. But either way, whether you choose to fluff it out or not, I always trim my yarn at least a 1/4 inch away from where I ended, just to make sure it's not going to, because if you cut it closer, it's just going to pop through. And if, you know, as you wear it, as you use it, I don't know if this one will pop through to the right side, but sometimes those tails will pop through to the right side when a garment is worn for the first time. totally not a problem. You're just going to grab, I don't have a crochet hook handy, but you could use a crochet hook, you could use your needle and just pull it through to the wrong side and leave it. Even if you've got like a little bit extra tail hanging out, I would prefer to have the extra tail because that's definitely, once you've got like, you know, that much tail hanging down, it's definitely never going to go through to the right side. And after you've washed and worn it a few times, you can retrim this a little shorter if you need to. So that is the vertical method. Very fast, very easy. Now I'm going to show you the diagonal method, which is, I actually prefer a little more because again, it spreads out that bulk. You know, the disadvantage to this vertical method is you've got 2 columns of woven in end right next to each other. So it does feel, you know, you can feel that spot. Even if you can't see it so much from the right side, you can feel it and the bulk is a little more concentrated. The diagonal method takes care of that by spreading the bulk out over a larger area. So it's a little trickier, but it's not too bad. So getting started, the same thing. And again, we're going to be paying attention to the rainbows and pearls. I'm sorry, rainbows and smiles. So I'm going to start right here in a rainbow. And oops, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving up a row. So there's the very next rainbow, but then over one. And so to me, it keeps me on track by thinking the fact that like, if I've gone through a rainbow most recently, my next purl bump is a smile. And then same thing, we're going to be moving up to the next smile and then over to the next rainbow. Up to the next rainbow, over to the next smile. So you can see I'm always moving up one row and over technically a half stitch. If we were looking at this really like every rainbow would be a stitch, the smiles in between are halfway in between the stitches. So I just did a smile. I'm going to go up to the next smile, over to the next rainbow. Up to the next rainbow, over to the next smile. Again, for about 1.5 to 2 inches. Up to the next smile, over to the next rainbow. Up, over, right, up and over, up, over. As you do this more, you'll have to do less of that sort of checking to make sure you're in the right spot. And once you feel like you've done enough, you just pull it through. And you can see already how much more raised. I'm not sure if it's coming across in the video, but the vertical method is more raised. The diagonal method is much less raised because we're spreading that out across multiple rows, across multiple stitches. And then we're just going to go down, making sort of like an A shape or an arrow shape. So I went up this direction. I'm now going to go back down this direction. I do usually, unless my piece is really big, flip it around because it's easier to work away from me for this step. So I'm just going to move over to the next, what's now a smile, was a rainbow, and then do the same thing. Up, over, up, over, up, over, up, over, up, over. Similarly, about another inch, 1.5 inches in the other direction. So now your bulk is spread out across multiple places. It's still nice and stretchy. And again, when we flip it over to the right side, shows through a little bit, but really very minimally. If this was the same color yarn, you would not be able to see this at all. So these are what I would recommend for this sweater. These are the 2 weaving in ends methods that I've used. As I said, I'm probably going to be doing mostly the diagonal method on mine when I get to weaving in the ends. And they're nice and secure. And again, same thing. You don't want to cut your yarn off right there. Cut it off 1/4 inch away or so. And I do usually give it a little tug in every direction. I didn't this time before cutting it off, but usually before trimming, I'll give it a little tug just in case that yarn is going to pop back through. You've sort of encouraged it to spread out as much as it needs to with the knitted fabric as it moves and as you wear it. So those are our 2 weaving in methods. And of course, if you have a favorite method, by all means, go ahead and use your method that you're already familiar with. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about blocking. So once you've woven in all of your ends, you're going to block. I have actually seen discussions about whether it's better to weave in ends before or after blocking. The advantage to doing it before is that the blocking process helps disguise those ends. So like, this little bit of bulk when it's blocked would actually become far less noticeable. However, there is the downside that especially if you're blocking something aggressively, you're going to be more likely to have those tails pop through. I solve that issue by just leaving, if I'm planning on blocking something really aggressively, I may not even trim my ends at all. I'll weave them in and just leave really long ends. And then after I've blocked it, go back through and snip everything off. But some people really prefer to weave in their ends after blocking. I disagree. I think before blocking is the way to go. But it's up to you. You can try both certainly and see what you prefer. So there are several different methods for blocking. We mostly recommend wet blocking. It's my personal favorite, especially right after you've finished a big project like a sweater. I've been carrying this sweater around now for about 5 months. I have spilled coffee on it. I have knit outside at the park and dropped it in the dirt. And even if you're, just at home, you're very careful, there's still, oil and dirt on your hands that gets into your knitting. The wet blocking both allows you to block your piece thoroughly and will wash out any dirt that's accumulated over the course of knitting the sweater. There are also steam blocking and spray blocking. Steam blocking you would use, if you have a handheld steamer, you can use that. I don't, so if I'm steam blocking, I use my iron and just sort of hover it over the fabric. You don't want to touch your fabric with your iron. You just hover with it on high steam, so it sort of blasts it with steam. Similarly, spray blocking, you would lay it out flat and then spritz it with water from a spray bottle until it's damp. You can certainly try those if you like, but I do really recommend wet blocking at least the first time. And Hiromi just put a link in chat to our how to hand wash a sweater, which is not strictly a blocking tutorial, but it does sort of shows how to get your sweater wet if you're going to be wet blocking it. Now for my sample here, this is my actual sweater. I put half of the hem in a sink of water last night. So we've had a lot of people, write in. This is my unblocked hem. This is the curved short row hem, and it has curled up, oh my gosh, three inches full. We've had lots of people write in and say, my sweater's curling and curling. Is it going to be okay? Yes, it's going to be okay. I didn't even do a good job of blocking. I just recently moved. I don't have my blocking mats. I don't have my blocking pins. I don't even have any sweater soap right now. So I dipped half of my sweater in a sink of just cool water. There was nothing else in there, and then laid it flat on a towel. And you can see already the huge difference there is between this curled up hem that has not been blocked and the back of my sweater, which is now laying really nice and flat. It will be better when I have everything. When I do the actual sweater, I will probably pin this out to make sure it lays nice and as flat as possible. But I think this is a good example because blocking sounds intimidating to a lot of people because there are all these tools that people talk about with blocking wires, blocking pins. Even if you don't have any of that, all you have to do is hand wash your sweater, lay it flat to dry, flatten out that edge as best you can, and let it air dry. That is sufficient for blocking a simple stockinette stitch sweater like this. It will improve the stitches. I'm not sure how well that's coming across in the video. Oh, let me put one of my sleeves up here. I think that'll be a pretty good example of how much more regular. So this is my sleeve that has not been blocked. And there's definitely a lot more irregularity in the stitches. Linen quill has a natural irregularity to it, so that's never going to entirely go away. But my stitches in the blocked portion are much more even. The yarn has plumped up and kind of filled in a lot of places where my stitches were not quite perfect. I often think of it as similar to if you sew. Pressing each piece of your sewing between steps gives you a much more finished look. Similarly, blocking your piece, even if it's as simple as just hand washing it, laying it flat to dry, will give you a much more actual finished look to your sweater. Now you can And I probably will when I block the whole thing. If you scroll to the last page of our PDF pattern, there's a schematic that shows all the measurements of the sweater, the measurement of the chest, the measurement of the sleeves. I often will, when I'm blocking a finished sweater, refer back to that schematic, get a tape measure, and make sure each piece measures what it says in the schematic while it's wet. So for instance, I'm doing the size 44. So if I go to the schematic for my size, on size 44, well, I don't actually have to look at the schematic because the sizes are the chest measurement. So the finished chest measurement of my sweater is going to be 44 inches. When I lay it flat to dry, it's half of that, it's 22 inches. So I'm just going to take my tape measure, check right under the underarms, under the underarms, and probably right above the curved hem to make sure it's 22 inches at both spots, to make sure it's just pretty close to square, pretty close to straight while it's drying. And then the other really key thing is once you've got your sweater laid out, you've uncurled your hem, you've measured everything, you can't touch it until it's totally dry. You have to let it completely air dry before you pick it up. And that will give you the best results. Make sure that hem stays as flat as possible and it all stays the correct size. All right, so that's blocking. And let me head back over to our other video, or my other camera. So I see we have some questions. All right, so Linda just asked, I have about 7 more raglan decrease rows. I'm doing a size 36. Should I be concerned that I will run out of linen quill? I have about a baseball size ball of yarn left. It's really hard to say, but it does sound to me like you'll be okay. It's a little trickier when you're doing a sweater like this. There are plenty of other projects where I will weigh my yarn that I have left, do a couple rows and weigh my yarn again. And then that will give you a good idea of like, oh, well, I probably can do about 10 more rows. I have enough or I don't have enough. Now, when you're doing a sweater like this, because you're decreasing, you are using less and less yarn each row. So it's a little harder to say. However, I would suggest doing that because it'll still give you a good idea. So let's say you weigh your yarn, you have 30 grams left. Then you do 4 rows, you have 25 grams left, which is not correct. I don't think it's going to take a gram per row in this sweater and this yarn. But still, even let's say you, just to be on the safe side, assume you're not, like, if you do the math as if you weren't decreasing anymore, that'll still give you a pretty good idea of how many rows you can do with a nice buffer to see if you think you might run out. But if you have 7 more raglan decrease rows, that would be about 14 rows total, plus the short rows for the neck. I think you'll be okay. And especially linen quill, to me, because it's so thin, there's a lot more yardage in this small ball of yarn than you think there's going to be. I always find thicker yarns run out faster when you have this size of a ball of yarn. Linen quill, there's a surprising amount of yardage in there. So I would suspect you'll be okay, but you can weigh it to give yourself just a little bit of peace of mind, a better idea of that. All right. Okay, we are in our question and answer section. So let me check and see if we have any questions that have come up, although I don't think I've seen very many. No, we haven't had any questions come up along the way. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Or if you would like to share your progress so far, please raise your hand and we'll invite you on screen. We do have instructions for raising your hand that we're going to put in the chat just in case you don't know how to do that in Zoom. Let's see. All right. And anybody want to come share your work? All right. Thanks for coming, Amy. Bye. All right. Okay, and I don't see anybody. Let me switch this to gallery view to make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh, Heather Twombly. Hi. Oh, look at that beautiful green sweater. Okay, there you
Hi.
are. Hi, Heather. How are you?
Good, good. I'm all done, so I'm just doing the underarm now, which I was
Wonderful.
waiting for this tutorial to do to see if I learned any new tips and tricks. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Oh, we can't wait to see you wearing it. Fantastic. Okay, thanks, Heather. All right. Okay. Galilee Beach Club. I believe you said your name was Joan, correct? Hi.
Yes, my name is Joan. I have an account with a volunteer organization I belong to, and no matter what I do, it doesn't want to take my name. So I apologize for that. I just posted some pictures on Instagram because I misread the pattern and thought my sleeves were done and had started my body and was doing fine. And I wasn't sure I had finished the sleeves properly. So I asked for a one-on-one Zoom, which was wonderful, highly recommended if you have a real question, and was very well helped by the fact that I had misread the pattern. And I had read for the size, I'm making a size 40, and I did follow the directions for the 36 because I misread the brackets as opposed to the parentheses. So I had to take out about 8 to 10 inches of sleeves on both sleeves, redo them, but I did. And here I am with,
Awesome.
I'm on the raglan decrease section. I've done about six rows of the decreases. So I've done about 12 rows. So I'm getting there, but
good.
Thank you for the Zoom.
Oh, you're welcome. I know it's such a, I have definitely done a different size on my sleeves before. That is something I think many of us have done at one point or another. But I'm glad you persevered and corrected it. And now you're back on your way. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you, Joan. Okay. And Andrea.
That's right, Andrea.
Hi, Andrea.
I'm actually wearing mine.
Sweater.
I'm wearing it. So
lovely.
I had to add a lot of length to get it to fit. And I thank the Zoom call last time to help me realize don't be so impatient. Just keep knitting.
I am right there with you. I am now, my body is 3 inches longer than the pattern at the moment. And I think I'm now done. My husband thinks I should do another inch, but I consulted with my work knitting friends and we all think it's fine. So
yeah, I did actually put it all together and then try it on and realize, nope, I got to take it off and undo it and redo it that way. And so that was fine. It fits really well. I'm super pleased with it. I'm from Seattle, so it's been cool here. So I've actually been able to wear it.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. And then I was going to say, I did have another idea for the underarm seam, which is what I've been using on all my sweaters now. You have the held stitches. I pick up 2 stitches on one side, knit those stitches, pick up 2 more stitches, then do the other same side, and then do the Kitchener stitch.
Just to help reduce that hole. Yes.
There's no holes that way. So it makes it more even for me for knitting through those held stitches too, I think.
That is a great tip. When I'm doing a top-down sweater, I do that by picking up extra stitches. Like I'll just pick up as many stitches as it takes to look like I've completely bridged the gap when I'm starting the sleeves on a top-down sweater, and then just do extra decreases to get rid of them. So that is a great idea to do a similar thing by picking up extra stitches with the bottom-up sweater. You will have to, get your needles back in there, but it's totally doable, and that's a great idea. Yeah.
The only problem is it adds 4 more stitches that you have to Kitchener stitch. So if you don't like doing the Kitchener, that doesn't. But I really don't like closing holes, and I don't like weaving in the ends like that. So that gets it for me. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed this project, and I would totally knit it again. So it was,
wonderful.
The linen quill is, I find, a little itchy, but I'm wearing a tank underneath, so with sleeved shirts.
it gets much better. I have a linen quill sweater that I knit, oh my gosh, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. And every time I wear it, I think it gets softer.
That's good
It's,
to know.
yeah, just like, a linen shirt or a linen suit, linen fiber is stiff. And then the more it gets worn and washed and used, the softer it gets. So it is, I agree that it's not the softest yarn. There are softer yarns out there. However, it gets better with time. So that's good. And Andrea, somebody just asked if you could write what you did for the underarm in the chat. I hope that's not.
Sure, I can. No, I can
yeah.
do that. No problem.
Okay, that would be wonderful.
Thank you
That
very
is a
much.
Great tip. Okay, thanks, Andrea. Okay, Lynn. Hi, Lynn. Oh, let's see. There we go. Oh, we can't hear you yet. Oh, there we go.
Okay, there we go.
Hi.
Hi, I'm actually Joni. I guess it logged into my girlfriend's Zoom instead of mine. But anyway, I'm Joni.
Hi.
And maybe, hi all. I think I am about 10 total rows left between a decrease and a regular before I get to the next, set up the neckline. I
Mhm.
just wanted to ask, as I was counting front, back, and sleeves, the number of stitches, if I am off a stitch or two, like the front has one more stitch than the back, the left sleeve has one more stitch than the other, is that a big deal? Or-
That's a great question. It is not a big deal, but I would correct it before you set up the
Okay.
neckline.
That's what I wanted.
Yeah, if this was something where it just ended, like if you just went into ribbing at the end, you'd be totally fine. I would not worry about a stitch here, a stitch there. However, because you do short rows at the neckline,
That's what
I don't want you to get confused. Like I could see, I mean, if it was me, I might just wing it and just figure out the short rows with the extra stitches. But it could also be confusing if you're following along with those short rows and checking all the stitch counts that are given on every odd numbered short row. So what I would do, since you still have a couple rows left before you set up, just adjust as needed. That could mean you said one of the fronts or the front has an extra stitch. So
Right.
on a plain row, just throw a decrease in the same place.
Okay.
You know, and if you have an so if you're shortest, or if you have an extra stitch, throw in an extra decrease on a plain row. If you're short a stitch, just skip a decrease. You know, when you're doing your decrease row, just leave out one decrease in that sleeve just to get on track and make sure you have the correct number of stitches in each section before moving on to the neckline setup.
Okay, that drives me crazy. You know, as I go and I just knit and knit and knit, and then I'm like, all right, what do I do? In fact, when I got to the raglan decrease, I had to frog back 30 rows because I decreased every row. I just, you know, my ADD, I must read. And I'm like, how did you miss that? But I did. So I said, I'm taking them out.
Sometimes you do. My knitting mistakes are usually the fact where I look at half the pattern and go, I know what I'm doing. And I don't read the rest of the pattern. And then I read it later and realize I didn't actually know what I was doing. So I have been there as well.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, once you get that, just, you know, use these couple rows that you have left to get back on track. And that way there won't be any confusion when you're doing those short rows at the neckline.
Okay, awesome. And did, I don't know if I missed, did we have a Zoom that you guys showed where you set up the neckline and get ready for that next section? Okay.
Yes, the May Zoom session. I did have a sample and talked about what you're doing, because there's that part where you have to cut your yarn and slip stitches. It's a little confusing if you haven't done before, but the May Zoom, the May Zoom session goes through that in detail. So that will be what you want to check out. Oh, and Hiromi just put a link in the chat for you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Great, guys. I love it. It's my first sweater.
Yay! I love fur sweaters. It's such an accomplishment. It feels so good. Awesome. Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks. Joni.
Oh,
That's
I'm
okay.
sorry. You said that.
No, that's
Sorry.
okay.
Thank you, Joni. Okay, and I just want to read out, since the chat will not be on YouTube, somebody said they have prominent ladders. Linda said she has prominent ladders on the sleeves. Do you have any suggestions for blocking those out? And Margaret answered with the perfect solution. First of all, blocking will correct a lot of that. Most ladders, if they're pretty mild, I'm going to see, I don't know if I necessarily have ladders on my sleeves. I have the opposite of ladders on my sleeves where I pulled too tight. I was doing magic loop and I pulled too tight, and you can see I have like sort of a crease in my sleeve that even if I pull it flat, I'm moving my hands the wrong direction. Even if I pull it flat, you can still kind of see that tight area where my join was. However, I know from experience that with blocking, with wearing, that is going to correct itself. And ladders similarly, while it's wet, give it a really good soaking. I like to soak my pieces for at least 15 minutes. Often I just forget and leave them in the sink for an hour, which is fine. But while it's really nice and wet, take each of those laddered areas and sort of hold your knitting on either side and do kind of this motion. That will move that tension back and forth and should help even it out a little bit. And then if it is still very visible to you, Margaret suggested exactly what I would do, which is to redistribute the tension, just like I showed with the Kitchener, how you're just going to use a tapestry needle, a very small crochet hook, and just sort of tug that tension out to the sides. So, you've got your loose tension in the middle. You're going to sort of tug that out to the sides to redistribute it. So you don't have one really loose area. You'll have a couple stitches on each side that are slightly loose, which will be not visible. That's something that will disguise that area so that you don't see that issue. All right. Okay, any last questions? Any last shares before we start wrapping things up? Okay, I'm going to unpin myself so we can all see our knitting friends, our fellow knit-alongers. All right, so I hope everyone is still knitting despite the heat. We hear from a lot of knitters that they don't knit as much in the summer, which I totally understand. I'm a very sticky person when it's hot, but I still manage to knit during the summer. And I've actually, I mentioned briefly, I've been moving. This sweater has been a great on-the-go project because I've just been in the stockinette section, so I can easily pick it up and put it down without having to worry about where I am, which is pretty nice. We are going to get this meeting uploaded to YouTube as soon as we can, probably within about the next week. If there's anything that you want to review, our next monthly knit-along email will have the link to this Zoom call. But if you want to know instantly, as soon as it's available, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and then you'll get a notification as soon as we upload a new video. Hiromi just put a link to our YouTube channel in the chat if you'd like to do that. If you still have a question that we didn't get to today, or if maybe you didn't want to come on screen, totally fine. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always email us both at customerservice@purlsoho.com or knit-along@purlsoho.com. We can help with questions about your gauge, specific problems. As Joan mentioned, she did a one-on-one help. This is a service we offer. It's totally free. If you go to our website and search Zoom or help, you'll come up with a link to sign up for our one-on-one help session where you can meet with a member of our customer service team on a video call and get some really in-depth help if you still have any questions. We really want to make sure that you're successful and end up with a sweater that you love, like Andrea. I can't wait to be wearing mine also. I can hardly believe it, but we only have 2 Zoom sessions left for this knit along. Our next one will be in about 6 weeks on August 19th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And then we're going to have one final Zoom call. The goal is to finish our sweaters by September 30th. So October 1st, we're going to have a final Zoom call, sort of like a finished object party. Hopefully, as many of you as possible will be wearing your sweaters. Hopefully it's cool enough to wear them by then for some of us. We'll be emailing you the link to sign up for the August Zoom and Knit shortly, but it is also available already at purlsoho.com if you want to go there and sign up. As always, thank you all for coming to the Zoom and Knit and for joining the Knit Along. We are having so much fun. The four of us were chatting about our sweaters before you guys all joined us. And it's just so exciting to see everybody's progress. And I'm already planning out. I have a skirt that I want to sew to go with my sweater. So I'm really excited to finish it. I hope you all are too. So please stay in touch, tag us on Instagram. Don't forget, we're still having monthly drawings. So you can, if you post on Instagram with our hashtag Purl Soho KAL, that will enter you for monthly drawings. You can also email us pictures of your sweaters to knitalong@purlsoho.com. And so please show us your progress, and we hope we'll see you at our next Zoom and Knit. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for coming.